Number 10. The Tiwanaku state's slow political unraveling. Some ancient collapses are remembered through dramatic invasion, sudden destruction, or royal murder. Tiwanaku is darker because its weakening appears to have unfolded through a slower process of political unraveling in which a major sacred and ceremonial center gradually lost the power to hold its wider world together. That is what makes the case so unsettling. Tiwanaku was not merely a city. It was the heart of a larger system of authority, ritual, exchange, and elite coordination centered in the Andean highlands near Lake Titicaca. Its monuments projected order, its ceremonial spaces projected permanence. But monumental confidence can conceal fragility, and once the networks that feed a center begin to loosen, the stone remains while the cohesion fades. What gave Tiwanaku its strength also created its vulnerability. Its power seems to have depended not only on force, but on its ability to organize ideology, prestige, agricultural systems, regional relationships, and elite legitimacy across a demanding landscape. A center built on that kind of integration can endure for a long time, but it also depends on constant maintenance of belief, cooperation, and distribution. When those links weaken, collapse may not arrive as one clean break. It arrives as erosion. The ceremonial core still exists. The political magnetism does not. The architecture still dominates the horizon. The state behind it begins to thin out. That is why Tiwanaku feels so haunting. Its decline suggests a world in which power could no longer reproduce itself with the same confidence it once commanded. Local relationships may have shifted. Supporting systems may have come under strain. Regional elites may have found less reason to remain bound to the old center. And once that process starts, a sacred political capital can become a monument to the authority it no longer possesses. The enemy is not necessarily a single conqueror. The enemy is disintegration itself, working slowly through a structure that once seemed immovable. What remains so disturbing is the image of grandeur outlasting control. Tiwanaku reminds us that ancient power centers do not always vanish the moment they begin to fail. Sometimes they remain visible precisely long enough to reveal the gap between appearance and reality. The walls still stand, the symbols still speak. But the political world that gave them force is already coming apart. That is why Tiwanaku opens this list. It is one of history's clearest reminders that collapse can begin not with a final blow, but with the long internal weakening of the bonds that once made a center feel eternal. Number 9. The Qin Dynasty's collapse after unification. Some states fall because they fail to impose order. Qin is darker because it fell after achieving one of the greatest acts of political consolidation in ancient history. That is what makes the case so brutal. The dynasty unified rival kingdoms, standardized systems, centralized authority, and imposed a model of rule that reshaped China permanently. From the outside, that looks like triumph. It looks like the birth of an enduring imperial machine. But the Qin collapse reveals how a state can appear strongest at the exact moment its internal rigidity is becoming fatal. It did not merely build power. It concentrated it so intensely that once pressure struck the center, the whole structure became vulnerable. What gave Qin its force also deepened its danger. Its system relied on severe control, administrative centralization, legal enforcement, massive labor demands, and a political order built around obedience to the throne. Such a machine can conquer quickly because it reduces ambiguity and crushes rivals with extraordinary efficiency. But systems built on fear and compression often struggle to absorb instability. They can command, they cannot bend. Once succession uncertainty, elite fear, popular resentment, or bureaucratic distortion enters such a state, the very centralization that once made it formidable can accelerate its disintegration. Power has nowhere else to go. Every crisis points back to the center. Every failure becomes imperial. That is what makes the Qin story so unsettling. The dynasty did not collapse because unification had failed to matter. It collapsed because unification had been achieved in a form too brittle to survive transition. The death of the founding ruler exposed the danger immediately. Court manipulation, succession struggles, and the distortion of authority at the top turned a seemingly invincible order into a crisis machine. Once the core was compromised, rebellion spread with shocking speed. The system had disciplined the realm, but it had not built enough durable trust to carry its own weight after the founding moment passed. The darker lesson is that scale alone does not create stability. Administrative brilliance, military success, and political concentration can produce an empire almost overnight. But that empire still has to survive the human realities inside its own structure. Qin had power, but power held in too narrow a channel can become unstable the moment it is contested. Its collapse feels almost paradoxical. A dynasty strong enough to end an age of division, yet too internally unforgiving to endure its own success. That is why the Qin case remains so chilling. It shows how a state can conquer history, only to be broken by the tensions inside the order it created. Number 8. The Achaemenid Empire's succession weaknesses. Some empires are destroyed by the force of an external conqueror. The Achaemenid Empire is darker because one of the greatest imperial systems of the ancient world carried within it a recurring internal danger that no amount of territorial scale could fully eliminate: the instability of succession. That is what makes the case so unsettling. From the outside, the Achaemenid state projected extraordinary reach, wealth, and administrative sophistication. It ruled across immense distances, incorporated many peoples, maintained royal roads, commanded tribute, and wrapped power in the grandeur of kingship. But the larger and richer such an empire becomes, the more dangerous uncertainty at the top can be. When the throne is not transferred cleanly, the empire's own size turns into a liability. What gave the Achaemenid world its strength also magnified its vulnerability. It depended on the person of the great king as a political, military, and symbolic center capable of binding many regions into one imperial order. That model can be extraordinarily effective so long as legitimacy remains clear and the ruling house stays cohesive enough to dominate rivals. But succession disputes, court competition, regional ambitions, and elite calculation can turn that same model into a breeding ground for crisis. An empire stretched across satrapies and dependent on layered loyalties does not respond lightly to uncertainty in the center. It begins to test the edges. Governors assess their chances. Nobles take sides. Local ambitions start to move beneath the language of imperial continuity. That is what makes Achaemenid instability so haunting. The empire was not weak in the ordinary sense. It could still command armies, wealth, roads, and prestige on a scale few ancient states could rival. But succession weakness introduces a poison that does not always announce itself through immediate collapse. It can linger as distrust, faction, and precedent. Every contested transfer of power teaches ambitious men that the throne can become a battlefield. Every court intrigue teaches provinces that imperial order may not be as seamless as it appears. The empire remains vast, but the confidence that holds it together becomes more fragile each time the center trembles. The darker truth is that great imperial systems often look most secure when they are actually storing up the consequences of unresolved weakness. The Achaemenid Empire could govern enormous territories, but the throne remained the nerve center through which legitimacy flowed. If that nerve center became unstable, the whole body could feel it. That is why the case belongs on this list. Long before the empire met its final external crisis, the recurring vulnerability of succession had already shown how easily internal uncertainty could place strain on even the grandest power structure. It is the story of an empire so immense that its weakness at the top could echo across continents. Number 7. The Aztec Triple Alliance's tribute tensions. Some empires fall because enemies gather overwhelming force from beyond their borders. The Aztec world is darker because one of its deepest weaknesses was embedded in the very system that made it powerful. That is what makes the case so disturbing. The Triple Alliance built dominance through conquest, intimidation, ritual prestige, and a tribute network that extracted goods, labor, and obedience from a wide range of subject peoples. From the imperial center, this looked like strength. Tribute flowed, military glory reinforced legitimacy, and expansion confirmed the right to rule. But systems built on extraction can accumulate resentment as efficiently as they accumulate wealth. What feeds the center can also poison its foundations. What gave the Aztec order its force also made it brittle. It relied not simply on administration, but on a political culture in which fear, obligation, and ceremonial domination helped sustain imperial authority. Subject communities were not all integrated in a way that dissolved local identities or erased the memory of coercion. Many remained bound to the system because resistance was dangerous, not because loyalty ran deep. That difference matters. A power structure can endure for generations while carrying beneath it a growing reservoir of anger. And when a crisis finally opens the possibility of defiance, resentment that once seemed containable can suddenly become strategic. That is why the Aztec case feels so dark. The empire's strength was real, but it was not universally accepted as legitimate by those forced to support it. Tribute tensions were not just economic burdens. They were political reminders of hierarchy and subordination. Every demand reinforced the divide between imperial center and subject periphery. Every act of extraction could preserve the empire in the short term while weakening the emotional and political bonds that might have helped defend it later. The state appeared formidable, yet much of that formidability depended on the continued success of intimidation. Once that aura faltered, buried hostility could rise with terrifying speed. The deeper lesson is that domination can disguise instability. The Triple Alliance seemed powerful because it had learned how to compel submission, but compelled submission is not the same as durable cohesion. A tribute empire can look magnificent at the center while becoming increasingly fragile at the edges, where memory of humiliation survives much longer than fear of punishment. That is what gives this collapse its force. The Aztec state was not simply attacked from outside by random fate. It faced the consequences of a structure that had long treated dependence as loyalty and tribute as proof of order. In the end, one of its greatest strengths became one of its most dangerous internal weaknesses, because the peoples who sustained the empire had too many reasons to welcome the moment it began to crack. Number 6. The Abbasid Caliphate's provincial drift. Some empires are undone by one dramatic civil war or one overwhelming invasion. The Abbasid Caliphate is darker because its weakening unfolded through a fragmentation so gradual and so deep that the center continued to exist long after much of its old power had already begun to slip away. That is what makes the Abbasid case so unsettling. Baghdad remained a symbol of immense prestige, learning, and caliphal legitimacy, yet the political world around it grew increasingly fractured, regionalized, and difficult to command. The caliph still mattered, but the caliph no longer ruled in the way the title implied. The image of unity survived longer than the reality of control. What gave the Abbasid order its greatness also helped create the conditions for internal strain. It governed an enormous and diverse realm stretched across multiple ethnic, linguistic, economic, and political worlds. Such scale can produce remarkable vitality, but it also places constant pressure on the center to balance provincial autonomy, military dependence, taxation, elite competition, and religious legitimacy all at once. Once that balance begins to weaken, fragmentation does not always arrive as open collapse. It arrives as drift. Governors become dynasts, military commanders become kingmakers. Regional courts preserve the language of caliphal order, while steadily reducing the center's real reach. The empire still exists, but more and more of its life is happening beyond the grip of its own capital. That is what makes the Abbasid decline feel so haunting. It was not simply a story of the center being destroyed. It was a story of the center being slowly outlived by the political realities growing around it. Provincial rulers could still invoke caliphal prestige when it served them, but symbolic loyalty is not the same thing as obedience. As regional powers strengthened, the caliphate became increasingly dependent on forces it could not fully master and on loyalties it could not permanently secure. The empire did not lose coherence all at once. It lost it layer by layer, province by province, until authority became more ceremonial than commanding. The darker lesson is that a power center can remain intellectually brilliant, culturally luminous, and symbolically immense even while its political body is quietly disaggregating. That is why the Abbasid case belongs here. The world still saw Baghdad, still recognized the caliph, still understood the old claims of universal order, but inside that framework the empire had already begun to separate into competing realities. Provincial drift is so disturbing because it does not look like dramatic failure at first. It looks manageable, temporary, reversible. Then one day the center is still standing, and the empire it once governed has largely become a memory wearing the clothes of continuity. Number 5, the Western Roman Empire's military fragmentation. Some states fall because they are struck by enemies too strong to resist. The Western Roman Empire is darker because its enemies became decisive in a world where the imperial military system itself had already grown fragmented, politicized, and unstable. That is what makes the case so chilling. Rome still possessed the language of empire, the prestige of law, the memory of conquest, and the institutions of statehood. Yet behind that image stood an increasingly fractured relationship between emperors, generals, frontier forces, court factions, and regional interests. The empire did not simply fail to defend itself. It became less and less certain about who truly controlled the means of defense in the first place. What gave the Western Empire its strength also deepened its vulnerability. Roman power had long depended on armies that secured borders, enforced imperial rule, and upheld legitimacy at the center. But once military command became tied more intensely to personal ambition, factional maneuvering, and regional bargaining, the army could no longer function purely as an instrument of stable imperial cohesion. It became part of the crisis. Generals rose through military power and then used that power to shape succession, pressure emperors, or pursue their own advantage. Troops could be redirected into civil conflict. Frontier defense could be weakened by internal struggle. The state still needed the army to survive, but the army was no longer reliably under the command of a unified political order. That is what makes the Western Roman collapse so unsettling. External groups did not become dangerous in a vacuum. They became more dangerous in a landscape where Roman political fragmentation kept eroding the empire's ability to respond with consistency and authority. The problem was not only pressure at the borders, it was that the imperial system repeatedly struggled to turn its own military resources into coherent long-term stability. Emperors depended on generals. Generals depended on soldiers. Soldiers depended on pay, loyalty, opportunity, and survival. Every disruption in that chain made the empire more brittle. Every contested succession or factional struggle made defense more uncertain. Rome still looked like Rome, but its machinery of command was no longer behaving like a secure imperial core. The darker truth is that military power can preserve an empire only when it remains integrated into a stable political structure. Once that integration weakens, armies do not merely defend the state. They begin to reveal the state's fractures. That is why the Western Roman Empire feels so tragic and so dark. It was not simply overwhelmed from the outside by brute force. It was increasingly hollowed out by a world in which military authority had become divided, personalized, and difficult to subordinate to lasting central control. In that sense, the empire's fall was not only the failure of defense, It was the failure of unity inside the very institution meant to guarantee survival. Number 4. The Khmer Empire's internal strains at Angkor. Some ancient power centers seem to fall because the world around them becomes too hostile or too unstable to control. Angkor is darker because one of the great monumental capitals of history appears to have been burdened by internal strains that made adaptation harder precisely when flexibility mattered most. That is what gives the Khmer case its haunting force. Angkor was not merely a capital in the ordinary sense. It was a vast, sacred political landscape of temples, reservoirs, canals, elites, labor systems, and royal authority, expressed through stone and water on an extraordinary scale. From a distance, such a center looks eternal. Its architecture suggests confidence beyond doubt. Its ceremonial order suggests a state fully in command of its environment. But systems built on immense coordination can become vulnerable when the very complexity that once sustained them becomes difficult to maintain, adjust, or hold together. What gave Angkor its greatness also deepened its fragility. The empire depended on the integration of kingship, religious legitimacy, hydraulic management, labor organization, regional authority, and elite cooperation. That kind of civilization can produce astonishing durability and brilliance, but it also requires continued political coherence at the center. If rivalries sharpen, if administrative control weakens, if local powers become harder to discipline, or if the burden of sustaining the monumental core grows heavier, then strain begins to spread through the very structure that once embodied imperial magnificence. A capital like Angkor does not need to be destroyed in one moment to begin losing command. It can start to loosen internally as the links between center, countryside, court, and ideology become less stable than the monuments imply. That is why the Khmer decline feels so unsettling. Angkor remained one of the most awe-inspiring urban and ceremonial worlds on Earth. Yet awe is not the same as resilience. Monumental power can conceal political exhaustion. Internal strain can hide behind ritual continuity. Royal grandeur can continue even as the machinery required to reproduce that grandeur grows more stressed, more fragmented, and less certain of itself. The darker possibility in the Khmer story is not simply that outside pressure mattered, but that the imperial center may already have been struggling to preserve cohesion on the scale its own system demanded. Once a state becomes too dependent on a complex and heavily coordinated model of rule, every internal weakness becomes more dangerous because the whole structure has more to maintain and more to lose. The deeper lesson is that greatness can become a burden when a civilization is asked to keep sustaining the same scale of symbolic and political control under changing conditions. Angkor belonged to a world of dazzling achievement, but dazzling achievement does not exempt a power center from internal fatigue. That is what puts it on this list. Its story suggests that collapse is not always the sudden defeat of a strong center. Sometimes it is the gradual overstraining of a center so vast, so complex, and so demanding that internal tensions begin to compromise the very coherence that made it magnificent in the first place. Number 3. The Neo-Assyrian Empire. After Ashurbanipal. Some empires are remembered for the terror they inflicted on others. The Neo-Assyrian Empire is darker because after reaching astonishing heights of military and political domination, it entered a period in which internal instability helped make that terrifying machine suddenly vulnerable. That is what makes the case so chilling. Assyria had built one of the most formidable imperial systems of the ancient world. Its kings campaigned relentlessly, its armies were feared across the Near East, and its state projected an image of ruthless command backed by overwhelming force. It looked like a power built to crush disorder wherever it appeared. But once the strongest military empire of its age begins to experience dynastic uncertainty, elite fracture, and internal weakening at the center, its very scale can turn from advantage into exposure. What gave Assyria its strength also sharpened its danger. The empire relied on aggressive kingship, military momentum, provincial administration, extraction, intimidation, and the constant demonstration that resistance would be punished without mercy. Such a system can dominate brilliantly while it is expanding under strong rulers. But systems so dependent on concentrated coercive energy can become unstable when the political center loses clarity. After Ashurbanipal, succession problems, factional tensions, and weakening royal control appear to have eroded the coherence that had allowed the empire to function as a unified engine of conquest. An empire built on fear has to keep proving that the fear still makes sense. Once its enemies detect hesitation and its elites detect weakness, the logic of domination begins to reverse. That is what makes the Assyrian collapse so disturbing. A state that had specialized in suppressing revolt now became less able to control the forces gathering against it. A machine designed to radiate terror from the center outward became vulnerable to fragmentation inside the center itself. Provinces, rivals, and enemies did not suddenly invent Assyria's weakness from nothing. They encountered an empire whose internal confidence had already been shaken. The brutality that once helped hold the structure together could not compensate for a failure of cohesion at the top. Military strength still existed, but military strength without stable political command becomes harder to direct, harder to trust, and harder to sustain across a vast imperial landscape. The darker truth is that empires built on relentless pressure can become catastrophically exposed when that pressure can no longer be coordinated from within. Assyria seemed indestructible because it had taught the ancient world to associate its name with conquest and fear. That is precisely why its rapid downfall feels so unnerving. The greater the aura of invincibility, the more terrifying it is when internal fracture reveals how dependent that aura always was on the stability of the ruling core. In the end, the Neo-Assyrian Empire was not simply defeated by hostile powers outside its borders. It was also betrayed by the internal instability that made one of history's most fearsome empires suddenly unable to remain what it had taught the world to fear. Number 2. The Mycenaean palace world in breakdown. Some ancient collapses are remembered as if a civilization simply disappeared into darkness. The Mycenaean world is darker because what failed was not only a collection of cities, but a palace-centered system whose internal structure may already have been too brittle to absorb mounting stress. That is what makes the case so unsettling. The great palaces of Mycenaean Greece projected hierarchy, storage, administration, elite authority, and organized control. They were not merely residences. They were hubs through which political power, economic management, redistribution, and status moved. From the outside, such a system can appear highly ordered, even formidable. But highly centralized systems often carry a hidden danger. When too much depends on the palace, any disruption to the palace becomes a crisis for the whole world built around it. What gave the Mycenaean palace order its force also deepened its fragility. It relied on concentrated administration, elite coordination, dependent labor, regional hierarchy, and a political economy tied closely to the authority of central nodes. That can produce impressive control, but it also creates a structure with limited tolerance for cascading disruption. If rivalries intensified, if trade strains grew, if local loyalties weakened, or if the palace centers themselves struggled to maintain cohesion, then the entire system could become vulnerable far more quickly than a looser order would. The darker possibility in the Mycenaean collapse is that the world behind the citadels may already have been under internal pressure before its final breakdown became visible in fire and ruin. That is why the Mycenaean case feels so haunting. Once palace authority begins to fail, the problem is not confined to one court. Storage, command, redistribution, craft organization, and elite legitimacy can all begin to unravel together. The state does not merely lose a ruler, it loses the structure through which rule has been made practical. In such a world, collapse is not just the fall of leadership, it is the breakdown of the system's own operating logic. The great centers still dominate the landscape, but their dependence on concentrated control means they can shift from symbols of strength to evidence of vulnerability with terrifying speed. The deeper lesson is that complexity without resilience can become its own trap. The Mycenaean palace world was sophisticated, organized, and powerful, yet those very qualities may have made it less capable of surviving sustained internal disorder. That is what places it so high on this list. Its fall suggests a civilization in which the centers of power had become so essential that once they began to fail, the wider world could not easily reassemble itself around them. The enemy was not only any blow from outside. The enemy was the brittleness inside a system that had tied too much of life, authority, and stability to the survival of the palace core. Number 1. The Hittite Empire's court fractures. Some empires fall because the frontier finally breaks. The Hittite Empire is darker because one of its most dangerous weaknesses appears to have lived inside the political heart of the state itself, where court instability, succession tension, and elite fracture could corrode the center on which everything else depended. That is what makes the Hittite case so chilling. This was a major late Bronze Age power, a kingdom of diplomacy, warfare, treaties, and royal authority that could stand among the great states of its world. From the outside, it possessed all the signs of legitimacy and stature. But for a kingdom so dependent on dynastic continuity and central command, instability inside the ruling structure was never a private problem. It was a threat to the entire imperial order. What gave the Hittite state its strength also sharpened its vulnerability. It depended heavily on the king, the royal household, elite loyalty, vassal management, and the ability of the center to project coherent authority across a politically demanding landscape. Such a system can be highly effective so long as succession is credible and the court remains disciplined enough to suppress dangerous rivalries. But when members of the elite begin calculating around the throne, when questions of legitimacy become contested, and when internal distrust enters the ruling circle, the empire's core starts generating the very uncertainty it is supposed to control. A frontier state can survive pressure from abroad more easily than it can survive poison at the center, because once the political heart becomes unstable, every external challenge grows more dangerous. That is what makes the Hittite collapse feel so unnerving. Court fracture does not always announce itself with immediate catastrophe. At first, it can look like intrigue, rivalry, faction, or temporary disorder among powerful figures who still speak the language of royal continuity. But each instability at the top teaches the rest of the system a devastating lesson. Authority may not be secure. Vassals begin to watch more carefully. Allies become less certain. Rivals become more attentive. The throne still exists, but confidence in the throne begins to thin. In an empire that requires constant negotiation between center and periphery, that loss of confidence can be fatal. The kingdom may still appear formidable, yet the center is already producing weakness faster than it can contain it. That is why the Hittite Empire takes the number 1 place on this list. Its story captures one of the darkest truths in ancient history. The collapse of a power center often begins where power is supposed to be most concentrated. Not at the walls, not at the border, not in the enemy camp, in the court itself. The Hittite world reminds us that once the throne room becomes unstable, the empire may continue standing for a time, but it is already living on borrowed strength. And that is what makes internal collapse so terrifying. The signs of greatness remain visible right up until the moment the center can no longer hold together the world built around it.